My name is David Higgins. Today's video is actually a re-edit of the very first YouTube video, which I shot back in 2017. I did that video on a cheap webcam and the resolution was terrible. So what you're getting today is the same footage, sort of cut up, and I slapped on a couple of filters to make it a little better watch than the old grainy footage. So in the video, I'm responding to an Off the Left Eye video called The Psychology of Jesus, and the target audience was people who are already pretty well acquainted with Swedenborg. I frequently reference Swedenborg's book, The Doctrine of the Lord, and also another book called Spiritual Christianity, which is written by Charles Augustus Tulk, who was the most brilliant and important Swedenborg scholar of all time. Okay, so please be patient with this humble presentation, even if you don't have a deep background in Swedenborg. I hope you'll watch, because I do present some information that is very important and helpful, even if you're brand new to Swedenborg's approach. Okay, well, enjoy. Okay, welcome back. This is the second part of a two-part video in which I will be addressing my response to Off the Left Eye's video titled The Psychology of Jesus. You can find that on their YouTube channel, and you probably want to watch that before you watch this. Otherwise, you won't really know where I'm coming from exactly. So I'm going to take issue with some of Jonathan's and Curtis's perspectives. The specific thing that's being addressed in this episode is the concept that the Lord experienced temptations. So in the Bible, Matthew chapter 4, we have this description of Jesus being led into the wilderness, and he was there tempted by the devil, and the three temptations. That's really all that we have that indicates temptation. However, his death on the cross, and particularly in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see him passing through temptation as well. So the fact that we have to understand what's happening here, what's that all about? So Swedenborg says that sacred scripture has levels of meaning, and he presents the various levels of meaning in his work Arcana Celestia. He goes through the books of Genesis and Exodus verse by verse and talks about the internal meaning. And Jonathan describes that. I won't reiterate that here because presumably people watched the episode. Around the 10-minute mark, Jonathan is talking about the internal layers in the Bible, and he says that there's a spiritual level and a heavenly level. And the spiritual level addresses our regenerative process, and the heavenly level addresses, it has to do with Jesus. That's a quote from, I wrote it down, around the 11-minute mark. Jonathan says that the heavenly level of sacred scripture addresses Jesus. So that right there is the point that I'm going to dispute. What does that mean? So earlier in the episode, this is from Arcana Celestia, and it's note 1403. They look at it in the video, and they talk about how Genesis chapter 12, which is where we pick up the story of Abram, and it proceeds into Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. And at that point, the word is said to contain actual historicals that contain an internal meaning. Prior to Genesis chapter 12, the word has internal meaning in made-up historicals. Okay, and Jonathan explains all that. I'm not going to explain it. But in note 1404, halfway down in the paragraph, in that paragraph, it was talking about the different things that Abram, Isaac, and Jacob represents. And I'll just read it. Abram, who was first treated of, represents in general the Lord, and specifically the celestial man. Isaac, who is treated of, in manner represents in general the Lord, and specifically the spiritual man. Jacob also in general represents the Lord, and specifically the natural man. So that part where it says each of these guys represents the Lord in general, that's where Jonathan says that refers to Jesus. So now I want to talk about the internal sense of Scripture and what exactly is the internal sense. And so Swedenborg says that the Bible, or sacred scripture, the word, is present in the next life. And then also when a man in the natural world is reading the Bible, angels are present and they are understanding the word according to more internal levels of meaning. And so when celestial angels are present when a man is reading the word, they are hearing heavenly truths, not the literal historical things that we are cognizant of. So in many places in Swedenborg, he tells us that angels are not even acquainted with the historical persons that are in the word. So when we read about Abram, angels are not thinking in terms of an historical person, but rather they're thinking of the spiritual things that are represented by Abram. Okay, so now in the very first part of Arcana Celestia, this is note number 2, where Swedenborg is at the very outset, he's introducing the idea that there is an internal sense in the word. Okay, so in note number 2 at the end, it says, "This could not be called the Lord's word or have any life in it unless it had reference to the Lord." And it says, "Everything in it, both in general and in particular, bears reference to the Lord." Okay, so everything in the word bears reference to the Lord. And then the very next phrase, it says, "Who is the very life itself." So when the word refers to the Lord, it refers to life itself with a capital L and a capital I, life itself. So it refers to the divine. Okay, so when in 1404 here, it says that Abram in general represents the Lord, he represents life itself, the divine itself, not historical Jesus. So what I'm challenging is Jonathan's statement that in the heavenly sense, these things refer to Jesus. When the name Jesus is evoked, it has a spiritual significance. And I'm going to read that to you. And this is from Arcana Celestia, note 3004. So when it says, "By the name Jesus, when named by a man who is reading the word, angels perceive divine good, and by Christ, divine truth, and by the two names, the divine marriage between divine good and divine truth." So a name in a literal statement of a name will often bring to mind a historical reality. You say the name Jesus to somebody, and Jesus did this or did that. We have a mental image of Jesus in the land of Galilee. We reference a historical event that happened more than 2,000 years ago. And now when we read in Arcana Celestia 1404 there that Abram represents the Lord in the innermost sense, that it has reference to the Lord, in the innermost sense, it does not have reference to a historical person of Jesus. It has reference to the Lord, and it has reference to divine goodness and divine truth. That is the Lord is life itself. So the innermost sense of sacred scripture does not refer to historical Jesus. That's to just cycle it right back down to the low external historical level. So I want to get more into how it is that we should read Swedenborg. And so right in the very next part of that thing, it's in 1405, the very next verse, it says, "The internal sense is of such a nature that all things in general and in particular are to be understood abstractly from the letter, just as if the letter did not exist. In the internal sense is the word soul and life, which does not become manifest unless the sense of the letter, as it were, vanishes." So the sense of the letter has to vanish and be replaced with abstract spiritual concepts. And Jesus presents himself as an abstract spiritual concept when he says, "I am the truth." And when the first chapter of John calls him the Word, and the Word was made flesh, that is obviously mystical and significative. It's emblematic language that allows us to abstract statements that we're about to read in the Bible. So when Jesus says, "I'm the truth," we're supposed to keep in mind that the external images are a parable expressing internal spiritual realities. So Jesus is God with us. Emmanuel means God with us. So he represents the Word. Everybody knows that. And so now the letter is different than the spiritual sense of the word. So now I want to read, this is from Apocalypse Explained, note 175, and it's talking about what exactly is the spiritual sense. So the verse that Swedenborg is explaining talks about peoples and nations, and peoples and nations have an abstract spiritual meaning. Then in the abstract, by people are understood truths and falsities, and by nations, goods and evils. So instead of peoples and nations, we're supposed to understand truths and falsities and goodness and evil. So whenever we're reading in the words about peoples doing this or nations doing this or that, we replace those, the letter vanishes, and we replace them with the spiritual terms, goodness and truth, and evil and falsity. So the true spiritual sense is abstracted from persons, spaces, times, and the things which are proper to nature. So if we're going to understand the story of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob spiritually, all reference to person needs to vanish, and we need to replace it with spiritual concepts that are essentially the varieties of goodness and truths and evils and falsities. So to take Abram and say it applies to our regeneration, well, what is our regeneration? Our regeneration is our evolutionary process where we mature in our reception of goodness and truth. Then in the innermost level that's above that, we're talking about goodness and truth itself in the Lord, in God. So the spiritual sense applies to us, and the celestial sense applies to goodness and truth in God. It doesn't apply to historical Jesus. Historical Jesus is the letter. It refers to person. It refers to time and space. It refers to the land of Israel and history. That's the literal sense. That's the natural sense. So the psychology of Jesus as a baby is all in reference to person. So now let's talk about Jesus being tempted. So it's all over Swedenborg's books where he talks about it appears in the Bible as if God becomes angry, and particularly God the Father is said to have become filled with wrath and whatnot, right? And Swedenborg is constantly saying that that's just an appearance, and that the appearance is based in the state of the Israelites who were, their doings were being described in those various places. Because they were in a negative place, God appeared to be full of wrath. So his wrath actually represented their state. So when it is said that Jesus bore our iniquities, so what it means to bear iniquities is an important part of the Christian faith, because it says that when Jesus suffered and was crucified, that he was bearing our iniquities. And how we're to understand that spiritually is critical. And so Swedenborg spends quite a bit of time talking about the Lord's suffering in The Doctrine of the Lord, which is a short work that Swedenborg specifically talks about the whole process of Jesus' life on the earth. In note 24, just previous to that, he talks about the fact that Jesus is sometimes described as the Son of God and sometimes the Son of Man or the Son of humanity. And Swedenborg says that in sacred scripture, whenever the suffering of the Lord is described, it's relative to the Son of Man. So now the Son of Man is Jesus as the Word. So the Son of God and the Son of Man, there's a distinction made there. Not that those are actually distinguishable in themselves, but we can divide them in our own rationality, and so that we can break it down and put it into smaller concepts and a rational train of thought so that we can form a conception of the divine through Jesus Christ. And so there's a distinction made, and the distinction that whenever Jesus is described as suffering, it is as the Son of Man. So they crucified the Son of Man. And that is to say, the Israelites at the day, Jesus was the symbolic embodiment of their spiritual state in relation to the Word, because they were the custodians of sacred scripture. So it's said that Jesus, or who was Jehovah God himself, descended into the natural world, assumed a human form through Mary, took upon himself a limited human form, and throughout his life in the world, he essentially expelled the fallen human nature, and it was replaced with a glorified humanity that was united to the divine itself. So in the Lord, through his life of continual temptation and victory, the human was glorified. So, what exactly that means rationally, to wrap your head around that is challenging. When you say that Jesus descended into the world of nature and put on humanity, you think, well, what? Did he gather atoms and electrons and whatnot? And it became a human body with a divine soul. And then to make that, it said that he glorified his human even to the limit, the outermost element of it. After his resurrection, he explains to his disciples that he has flesh and bone. And that's to indicate that his humanity was 100% made divine. And so it's very challenging to think, well, are we talking about some sort of infinite physical reality? And when we say that, well, the divine is present but not in space, what exactly do we mean by that? And Swedenborg talks a lot about that kind of thing, and the science of correspondence, and particularly the manner in which Tolkien challenges us to understand Swedenborg. The only way you can make rational sense of it is to recognize that their basis of reality is in fact spiritual. And I'm not going to get into it right now, but if y'all will please read this book. I've been trying to get folks to read this book forever, and nobody seems to be able to get into it. And I can go on and on about the science of correspondence, but I'm trying to stick to the doctrine of the Lord right now, so I'm going to try and go back. Where was I? So we were talking about Jesus as the Son of Man suffering, and that's the Lord as to divine truth of the Word. And in Apocalypse Explained, note 805, Swedenborg talks about what it means that it is said that the Lord bore iniquities as the grand prophet. So the prophets in the Old Testament famously represented the reception of the word by the nation of Israel, and they were asked to perform symbolic behavior that represented the spiritual state of the children of Israel. They did all kinds of crazy stuff, and it was all spiritually representative. And then it being said, so I'm going to read this as a note 805, Apocalypse Explained. The like is also understood by bearing iniquities when it is spoken of concerning the Lord. For he represented in himself how contumeliously the Jewish church treated the divine truth or the word. For he was the word itself. Wherefore their scourging him, spitting on him, smiting him with a reed, setting a crown of thorns upon him, giving him vinegar to drink, dividing his garments, and lastly crucifying him, were all representative of the state of the church. This is what is signified by bearing iniquities. This is what is signified by the temptations he is said to have borne. So it being said that he was tempted represented the state of the Jewish church. So what is it to be tempted spiritually? Is that you have a true idea and a false idea attacks it. So that's the spiritual understanding of what it is to be tempted. Okay, so when it is said that Jesus was tempted, that is to say, Jesus being divine truth, the word, in the internal sense, we abstract from the person of Jesus and we talk about what Jesus represents. And Jesus represents divine truth with us. So he represented the divine truth, sacred scripture, with the nation of Israel. So that truth was assaulted by falsity. That is what it is said when it is said that Jesus was tempted. Divine truth was assaulted by falsity in the minds of the nation of Israel at that time. So it being said that the Lord was tempted is a representative statement. So when you say the child of Jesus was tempted, what is the child of Jesus? So let's talk about the divine humanity. Now, the divine humanity is a very important. Okay, I'm looking for AE 113. So Apocalypse Explained number 113. And it's going to talk about what is the divine humanity. It's talking about the Son of Man. So this is taken from Swedenborg's exposition of the second chapter of the book of Revelation, where the Son of Man is being described as the Alpha and the Omega. So the divine humanity of the Lord. What is the divine humanity of the Lord? And when we say that it was glorified. So first of all, we need to know what the divine humanity is. The divine humanity of the Lord is, here's Swedenborg's definition. So this is really important. Swedenborg defines terms and then uses them freely. He'll go on and on and on about the divine humanity, but you got to find out where he says what he means by the term the divine humanity. And here it is. By the divine humanity is meant the all in all of the church and the all in all of heaven. Jesus is God with us. The divine humanity is God coming down to our level and filling our minds. That's the divine humanity. In the next number, in note 1404, it says that we cannot think of the humanity of the Lord as we do the humanity of another man. It's when we refer to the humanity of the Lord, you can't think of it in the same way that you think of my humanity. You have to think of it as goodness and truth itself being received by us. That is the all in all of the church. So when it said that Abram in general represents the Lord, he represents the divine humanity of God, which is goodness and truth itself as received in the human collective consciousness. Abram does not represent historical Jesus. Abram represents the divine humanity. Historical Jesus also represents the divine humanity. Historical Jesus is a representative image. So, what's the next thing we need to talk about here? In Apocalypse Explained, number 63, this is another thing that Tulk points out that's extremely important. So, we read that the divine humanity is the all in all of the church. So, in note 63, there's the statement, the signification of the Son of Man as denoting the Lord as to the divine human principle and also the divine truth because it proceeds from his divine humanity. So, that word principle is something that Tulk takes issue with. He's a Latin scholar, and he said that in his day, that word was being added in, that what is actually written in so many places is it'll say the human or the natural or the spiritual or various terms, and the translators would add in that word principle. So I'm going to read you a little bit of Tulk here. So he's talking about issues that he takes with translators. And then this one is going to be talking about this word principle. And this is from the preface of this book, Spiritual Christianity. And if you read the preface alone, it's going to raise so many issues in your mind that you won't be able to not read the rest of the book. It's a powerful intro to some serious incongruities in the way we might be understanding Swedenborg. So I just can't recommend this book enough. Anyway, so another cause which unfold incongruities in our understanding. So he's referring to such words as natural, sensual, corporeal, which have been rendered in the English translation the natural principle, the sensual principle, the corporeal principle. Now, the word principle, which has been thought to be peculiarly applicable because it conveys no definite meaning. So when you say natural principle, that's pretty vague. And the translators tacked it in there because they thought it helped things along. But the word is not actually there in the original. Okay? It just says natural. Now, the word principle thought that it was applicable because it conveys no definite meaning, but it leaves every reader to make one meaning for himself. But often our thought is led into the wrong channel. Thus, the word natural, in consequence of it being translated the natural principle, has been thought to mean some subtle element which pervades this natural world, a kind of invisible, efficient cause pervading the grosser compositions which we're able to see and handle. So, but Tolkien is saying that that word is not there, principle, and that we need to be very careful to understand what Swedenborg means when he says just the word natural. And I'm going to read to you from Arcana Celestia, note 5301. And it says, and this he's talking about the land of Egypt, and it says that the land of Egypt signifies the natural mind. And then now here's the important definition that we need to really latch onto. And it applies to all those other words, such as sensual, corporeal, rational. So it is here and elsewhere said, the natural. Thereby is meant the natural mind. Man has two minds, a rational mind and a natural mind. The rational mind is of the internal man, and the natural mind is of the external man. This mind, or this man, is what is meant by the natural, simply so called. The mind is the man himself. Okay, so whenever Swedenborg is using the term the natural, he's not talking about the worlds of atoms and electrons. He's talking about the natural mind. So when it is said that the Lord descended into the natural, it is to say that divine truth came into the natural mind. Okay? So it's not talking about the world of elementary particles of the natural principle. Okay? So that word principle needs to go away. And when Swedenborg says the natural, he just means the natural mind. Okay, he doesn't mean some elementary principle or particle or anything like that. So it's not saying that the Lord descended into the world of atoms and electrons. He descended into the natural mind. So this is all talking from the science of correspondence. And the physical world, as we perceive with our senses, has a false appearance, as if it were some sort of external matrix with a self-existent sort of stage and elemental basis of particles. That's not the way things really are. The physical sensual world that we perceive to be out there is actually the outermost layer of our collective consciousness. So when Jonathan and Curtis and the General Church and most other readers of Swedenborg refer to the doctrine of the Lord as understanding it in a sort of a mixed spiritual historical notion, they fall into some serious errors. Okay, so in the doctrine of the Lord, it talks about Jesus having two states of mind while he was in the world. One was, the fancy term is exinanation, which is emptying out, and the other is glorification, which is when a human element or aspect of the Lord was united to the divine. So when he was in a state of separation, that was to say that his humanness that he received from Mary was being expelled. And then when he was in a state of glorification, it is to say that his humanity was entirely united to the divine at that time. So what happened in the Gospels, there are times when Jesus was most obviously one with the divine and it was performing miracles, and particularly when he ascends up the mountain with Peter, James, and John, is revealed in his glorified form. That's when he was in this state of glorification. And then there was the alternative state when he was in his fallen humanity. So if we're trying to understand this as we would understand any other human, which we're told not to, but if we think of Jesus in terms of another human being, we would say, oh, when I'm happy, I feel close to God, and when I'm sad, I feel far away from God. But that's really not even close to saying that one minute Jesus knew he was God and the next minute he didn't know that he was God. That's really some pretty insane sort of schizophrenia, right? How do you one minute fully know that you are God and then the next minute forget it? So it being said that he was tempted and that he suffered, and it being said that God gets angry, it's all symbolic language, okay, figurative language. And we cannot take it literally. We cannot think of Jesus as we think of another person. So when we apply psychology to Jesus, we're making a mistake. We apply psychology to normal people. Okay, we have internal processes, and we can talk about fluctuations in our emotions and whatnot, but there was no emotional fluctuation in God. And the image that we have of Jesus is not God as he is in himself, but it's God embedded in the natural mind of the nation of Israel and representing its receptivity and non receptivity in effigy. Jesus is a parable. Historical Jesus is a parable. Again, if we try to interpret that parable and we try to mix the spiritual and the natural perspectives, we fall into all kinds of nonsensical incongruities. It's nonsense to think that Jesus knew he was God and then forgot he was God. And Tolk goes through it in 350 pages. I gave you the soundbite version, and I challenge all Swedenborg scholars to chew on what I've just said and then chew on spiritual Christianity. And I'm thinking that it's going to really fundamentally change the way you understand Swedenborg in relation to the doctrine of the Lord. It's one thing to discuss our regeneration or the world beyond the grave. That's child's play compared to trying to understand the doctrine of the Lord spiritually. But understanding the doctrine of the Lord spiritually is the most fundamentally important doctrine, according to Swedenborg. And the reason being is that if God is divided into three persons and Jesus's humanity is divided into two, it is said that our concept of the divine just falls to dust and we end up with materialism. And the same thing happens if we try to approach God in the concepts of time and space. Swedenborg famously says that if you try to approach the divine when your thinking is bound in the natural world, that you will not succeed. So you can't rationally make sense of Jesus if you are still thinking in time and space and in history. So we need to understand it spiritually in order for it to make sense. But in any case, I believe that a truly spiritual understanding of the doctrine of the Lord is critical at this juncture in our collective experience in the world, because historical Jesus and all its implications is wreaking havoc in the world right now. So that's a loaded statement that we can talk about in the future. Hopefully, I would love to have any kind of conversation with anybody about all of this that I just put out there. So God bless, and hope to hear from you soon. Bye, con Dios. Okay, hello again. Thanks for hanging in till the end. And I will tell you that on my website, rationalmetaphysics.com, you can find a link to a PDF of the book Spiritual Christianity by Tulk. And I hope you will take the time to at least read the preface. In my opinion, that 32 pages is the most important bit of Swedenborg commentary ever written. Of course, please comment, like, and subscribe to help the channel gain a little traction. And if you would like to support the channel, there's info about how to do that in the description. Okay, well, Bible scholars, until next time, keep smiling and keep doing good. Thanks for watching.